The 1980s were a playground of imagination where cartoon universes collided in ways both bizarre and brilliant. Heroes met villains they were never meant to face. Sidekicks swapped worlds. Franchises fused for marketing glory. But behind the Saturday morning smiles, these crossovers hid strange stories of studio deals, forgotten experiments, and creative chaos. Do you remember them all? Scooby-Doo meets Batman, 1981. When Scooby-Doo's gang teamed up with Batman and Robin, audiences thought they'd struck cartoon gold. The original crossover dated back to the 1970s, but reruns in the early 80s cemented its legend. Warner Brothers and Hanna-Barbera saw this as a way to refresh Scooby's sagging ratings while showcasing DC heroes outside of comics. The dynamic was instantly peculiar. Batman, drawn as the stoic crime fighter, often played the straight man to Scooby's slapstick panic. Robin cracked jokes, Velma dropped her signature logic, and suddenly it felt like two shows stitched into one uneasy partnership. Yet children adored it. Toy sales spiked, lunchboxes filled with Bat-Scooby art, and network executives saw dollar signs. Behind the scenes, not everyone was thrilled. DC purists complained that Batman was softened into a babysitter for bumbling teens. Meanwhile, Scooby's writers had to balance mystery plotting with superhero gadgets, often leading to odd tonal clashes. But this mashup endured, proving the 1980s appetite for crossover events long before cinematic universes became fashionable. Today, it's remembered as campy, strange, and endlessly nostalgic, a reminder that even the Dark Knight once solved mysteries alongside a talking Great Dane. The Jetsons meet the Flintstones, 1987. Imagine Stone Age families and Space Age dreamers colliding. That's exactly what Hanna-Barbera delivered in The Jetsons Meet the Flintstones. Airing as a TV movie, it promised the ultimate crossover between their two flagship families. The story used a time machine accident to transport the Jetsons back to bedrock, leading to a clash of technologies, cultures, and comedy. George Jetson struggled with stone wheels while Fred Flintstone ogled futuristic gadgets. It was part sitcom, part science fiction parody, and fully designed to revive waning interest in both shows. Behind the laughter was corporate calculation. Hanna-Barbera was desperately trying to keep its legacy properties alive amid a new wave of Disney and Nickelodeon animation. The crossover pulled in impressive TV ratings, but critics panned it as a shallow gimmick. Animation shortcuts, recycled gags, and tonal inconsistencies were hard to ignore. Still, for children of the 80s, it was an event. Two universes that defined Saturday mornings finally met. While not artistically groundbreaking, the film became a VHS staple, sealing its place in cartoon crossover history. Alf. The animated series meets Gilligan's Island, 1988 special. By the late 80s, Alf had become a cultural juggernaut, spawning toys, sitcoms, and an animated spin-off. But nothing prepared fans for his bizarre crossover with Gilligan's Island. In a one-off NBC special, the wisecracking alien interviewed Gilligan's castaways in cartoon form. The gimmick was surreal. Viewers expected a standard ALF episode, but instead got a hybrid variety show mixing live-action nostalgia with animated antics. Critics were baffled. Why mash up a sci-fi puppet sitcom with a 1960s island farce? The answer: rating stunts. NBC hoped to milk ALF's popularity while reigniting interest in Gilligan's Island reruns. Animation insiders later admitted the production was rushed, with inconsistent artwork and clumsy jokes. Yet kids tuned in, and the crossover remains a bizarre time capsule of 80s television excess. It showed how networks weaponized nostalgia and star power, even when the pieces didn't quite fit. Transformers and G.I. Joe commercial crossover, 1985 to 1987. Though they never officially shared a Saturday morning storyline, Transformers and G.I. Joe crossed paths in TV commercials and Marvel Comics. In the mid-'80s, Hasbro, which owned both franchises, cleverly staged cross-promotions where toys appeared side by side, teasing the idea of a shared universe. Kids speculated endlessly. Could Optimus Prime team up with Duke? Would Cobra ally with Megatron? Though the animated shows kept separate worlds, commercials blurred the lines, airing during the same programming blocks, sometimes even sharing animation studios. Marvel Comics went further, launching limited-run crossovers that deepened the mythology. Behind the scenes, Hasbro feared blending the shows too directly would dilute toy sales. Still, this semi-crossover planted seeds for fan fiction, conventions, and modern nostalgia. Today, fans look back on those commercials as the lost universe of 80s cartoons, proof that even 30-second spots could spark imaginations. Muppet Babies crossovers, 1984 to 1989. Muppet Babies was already groundbreaking for mixing animation with live-action clips, but what set it apart were the constant crossovers with other properties. From Star Wars footage to Indiana Jones homages, the show blended Jim Henson's creations with Hollywood classics in ways that startled adults and delighted children. Each episode leaned on archival film snippets, licensed at great expense. Seeing Baby Kermit wielding a lightsaber or Miss Piggy echoing Marilyn Monroe became cultural touchstones. The behind-the-scenes challenge? Securing rights from reluctant studios. George Lucas himself personally approved Star Wars segments, recognizing the cross-promotional value. Critics called it clever marketing disguised as children's television. Yet Muppet Babies had heart, using crossovers to fuel imagination rather than product placement. By the end of its run, it had become a cherished symbol of creative risk-taking in Saturday morning programming. It proved crossovers weren't just stunts. They could be storytelling magic. The Smurfs meet Johann and Peewit, 1981 to 1989. When most people think of the Smurfs, they imagine the little blue creatures battling Gargamel or living peacefully in mushroom houses. But throughout the 1980s, the Smurfs often crossed paths with Johann and Peewit, characters from the original Belgian comics. Hanna-Barbera introduced them into several story arcs, blending medieval adventure with Smurf-sized fantasy. To children watching on Saturday mornings, it seemed natural. But behind the scenes, this was a conscious effort to honor Peyo's original Smurfs comic universe, where Johann and Peewit were actually the lead characters. The Smurfs had originally been their sidekicks before outgrowing them in popularity. By reuniting the two worlds, Hanna-Barbera hoped to ground the whimsical Smurfs in bigger adventures while pulling in European fans who knew the comic roots. The results were surprisingly effective. Episodes featuring Johann and Peewit had a richer narrative scale, often involving castles, knights, and long quests instead of simple village life. The Smurfs became part of a larger fantasy epic, giving viewers a taste of medieval legends alongside cartoon slapstick. Critics noted the tonal shift, sometimes darker, sometimes more adventurous, but children embraced it. These crossovers are now mostly forgotten outside hardcore Smurf historians, yet they reveal how the 1980s animated world quietly experimented with continuity long before expanded universes became the norm. For many fans, Johann and Peewit remain the forgotten cousins of Smurf history. He-Man and She-Ra, Secret of the Sword, 1985. Few crossovers of the 1980s felt bigger than the union of He-Man and She-Ra. Conceived as both a theatrical movie and a multi-part TV special, Secret of the Sword introduced audiences to She-Ra, He-Man's long-lost twin sister. It wasn't just a crossover, it was a carefully engineered launchpad for Mattel's new toy line aimed at girls. The crossover was monumental for fans. Seeing Eternia's iconic hero fight side by side with a brand-new warrior princess gave the Masters of the Universe franchise fresh energy. The story was darker and more emotional than typical episodes, revealing Adora's brainwashing by the evil Horde and her transformation into She-Ra. For young viewers, it was a dramatic expansion of a universe they thought they already understood. Behind the scenes, this crossover was a gamble. Mattel worried about alienating boys who might see She-Ra as too girly, while Filmation had to balance storytelling with toy marketing. Still, the crossover performed well both in theaters and on television, cementing She-Ra as a cultural icon in her own right. The legacy of Secret of the Sword is massive. Not only did it spark debates about gender representation in children's programming, but it also showed that animated crossovers could serve as franchise-building events, rather than cheap gimmicks. For fans of 80s cartoons, it remains one of the most beloved unions of two worlds. Yogi's Treasure Hunt, 1985 to 1988. Hanna-Barbera had dozens of beloved characters by the mid-80s, but rather than retire them, the studio brought them all together in Yogi's Treasure Hunt. In this cartoon, Yogi Bear became the leader of a ragtag crew, including Quick Draw McGraw, Huckleberry Hound, Snagglepuss, and Augie Doggie, as they traveled the world searching for treasures. For children, it was like watching a dream team of Saturday morning icons in one place. Each episode featured slapstick comedy, pop culture references, and a villain of the week trying to sabotage Yogi's crew. Behind the cheerful antics, though, Hanna-Barbera was engaging in clever brand preservation. Many of these characters were losing relevance, but putting them in a crossover series kept them alive for a new generation. The show's production was chaotic, with animators juggling dozens of established character personalities in each script. Yet that chaos became part of the charm. Episodes often felt like crossover carnivals, with characters playing off each other's quirks in ways fans never imagined back in the 1960s. While Yogi's Treasure Hunt isn't often remembered today, it represented Hanna-Barbera's first real attempt at an interconnected universe. In many ways, it predated the cinematic crossovers we see now, showing how nostalgia and reinvention could work hand in hand. The Real Ghostbusters Meet Garfield and Friends, commercial crossover, 1987. On paper, The Real Ghostbusters and Garfield had nothing in common. One was a supernatural comedy, the other a sarcastic cat sitcom. But in the 1980s, Saturday morning commercial blocks often blurred those boundaries. In a now largely forgotten NBC promo campaign, Garfield and the Ghostbusters shared the screen to advertise Saturday morning lineups. These shorts were playful and self-aware. Garfield mocked the Ghostbusters for chasing imaginary friends, while Slimer tried to eat lasagna. It was marketing fluff, but for kids, it was proof their favorite shows lived in the same universe, if only for a few seconds. Behind the scenes, this crossover existed because Lorenzo Music, the voice of Garfield, was originally the voice of Peter Venkman in The Real Ghostbusters. The network capitalized on this connection, crafting promos that winked at audiences while doubling as cross-promotion for toy lines. Critics barely noticed, but children remembered. For decades, rumors swirled about whether Garfield and the Ghostbusters ever shared a full episode, though in truth, it was only a commercial campaign. Still, those promos showed the power of even tiny crossovers to fuel playground debates and fan fantasies. Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein and Wolfman, 1987 to 1988 specials. Before Scooby-Doo cornered the market on monster mashups, Alvin and the Chipmunks delivered their own spooky crossovers. In late 80s, TV specials, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore found themselves face-to-face with classic Universal-style monsters like Frankenstein's creature and the Wolfman. These specials were both playful and atmospheric, mixing slapstick comedy with surprisingly gothic visuals. Alvin, ever the show-off, treated monsters as opportunities for stardom, while Simon analyzed them scientifically, and Theodore quaked in fear. For young audiences, it was equal parts funny and frightening. Behind the curtain, the specials were part of a licensing push. Universal owned the monster rights, and pairing them with the Chipmunks gave both brands renewed relevance. Production costs were high, with elaborate animation sequences mimicking old black-and-white horror films. The crossovers were successful, airing repeatedly around Halloween and eventually landing on VHS. For many children, it was their first introduction to Frankenstein or the Wolfman, not through old horror movies, but via a singing trio of chipmunks. These specials may be forgotten now, but they captured the strange alchemy of 80s crossovers, the blending of icons from entirely different worlds to create something unforgettable. Hanna-Barbera's Superstars. 10 crossover movies, 1987 to 1988. In the late 80s, Hanna-Barbera launched the Superstars 10 TV movie series, which was essentially a giant crossover event. Beloved characters like Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, the Jetsons, and the Flintstones starred in original feature-length adventures. On the surface, these films seemed like a nostalgic gift. In reality, they were Hanna-Barbera's attempt to repackage old icons for the VHS market. The crossovers ranged from Yogi's Great Escape to the Jetsons Meet the Flintstones, each pulling together fan-favorite characters into bigger adventures. Kids marveled at the chance to see characters from entirely different decades sharing scenes. But critics quickly noticed the animation shortcuts and formulaic plots. These weren't Disney-quality productions. They were network stunts with just enough charm to hold a child's attention. Still, they worked. Ratings were strong, VHS sales were steady, and Hanna-Barbera kept its characters alive during a period when newer studios were dominating Saturday mornings. Behind the scenes, executives admitted the movies were never about art. They were about survival. By uniting their cartoon icons under one banner, Hanna-Barbera reminded families why those characters mattered. Today, the Superstars 10 crossovers are remembered less as cinematic achievements and more as cultural time capsules. They symbolized an era when networks leaned on crossover magic to squeeze one last spark from aging franchises. Garfield and Friends meets US Acres, 1988 to 1994. One of the strangest yet most natural crossovers was hiding in plain sight every Saturday morning. Garfield and Friends regularly paired everyone's favorite lasagna-loving cat with the barnyard. Antics of US Acres, another comic strip created by Jim Davis. At first, children were confused. Why was a sarcastic cat suddenly sharing airtime with a pig named Orson and a paranoid chick named Sheldon? But that was the point. CBS packaged both Jim Davis creations into a single half hour, giving the audience 2 shows for the price of 1. Behind the scenes, the crossover was purely contractual. Jim Davis wanted to promote US Acres, which wasn't nearly as popular as Garfield. By attaching it to the Juggernaut cat's success, CBS hoped to build a second merchandising empire. Unfortunately, US Acres never caught fire, fading from public memory once Garfield and Friends ended its run. Yet for children of the 80s, the pairing became normal. Garfield would complain about Mondays, then audiences would pivot to Orson's farmyard worries. It wasn't a shared universe in the traditional sense, but it was a crossover in format, 2 very different worlds stitched into one television block. Looking back, this forgotten fusion reminds us how the 80s constantly experimented with hybrid programming. Sometimes the results were legendary, sometimes forgettable, but always daring. Pound Puppies Meet the Skyrocket Pets, 1987 Special. The Pound Puppies franchise had become a hit thanks to its line of cuddly toys and the Saturday morning cartoon. But in 1987, the franchise attempted a little-known crossover with a short-lived animated property called the Skyrocket Pets. In a made-for-TV special, the grounded puppies teamed up with these rocket-powered animals to stop a villain threatening both their worlds. The idea was ambitious, blending the safe, heartwarming tone of Pound Puppies with the sci-fi action of jet-fueled pets. The execution, however, was bizarre. Critics at the time mocked the crossover as shameless toy marketing, and children were left divided. Some loved the novelty, others felt confused by the sudden tonal whiplash. Behind the scenes, executives were desperate to expand the Pound Puppies brand. Toy shelves were crowded, and a new gimmick was needed to keep the puppies relevant. Unfortunately, Skyrocket Pets never caught on, and the crossover faded into obscurity almost immediately. For those who remember it, the special stands as a perfect example of 80s corporate creativity, where two toy lines could collide in a desperate attempt to capture young imaginations. The Flintstone Kids Meet. Captain Caveman, 1986 to 1990. When Hanna-Barbera launched the Flintstone Kids, it seemed like another simple babyfication spin-off. But what made it unique was its regular crossover with Captain Caveman, reimagined as a bumbling superhero babysitter for the younger Bedrock gang. Each episode included a segment called Captain Caveman and Son, where the wild-haired prehistoric hero solved crimes with his equally goofy child. The crossover was marketed as a show within a show, blending slapstick with Saturday morning superhero. Parody? For young viewers, it was an endless delight. Behind the scenes, the decision was strategic. Captain Caveman was a cult character from the 1970s who hadn't found lasting success. By placing him alongside the Flintstone Kids, Hanna-Barbera resurrected the character for a new generation. The segments weren't groundbreaking, but they were memorable. They showed how even minor cartoon figures could be woven into larger universes when studios needed to stretch a brand's lifespan. Today, the crossover is remembered fondly by fans who grew up with the oddball antics of Captain Caveman shouting, "Beckman meets the Saturday Supercade, 1983 to 1984. Video games and cartoons collided spectacularly in Saturday Supercade, a show that featured rotating segments starring Frogger, Donkey Kong, and other arcade icons. But the real star was Pac-Man, who also had his own dedicated cartoon series. In a few crossover moments, characters from the Supercade would cameo in Pac-Man's world, creating one of the first video game shared universes. Audiences loved the novelty. Watching Donkey Kong swing past Pac-Land or Cuber exchange banter with the Pac family felt like seeing their arcade dreams come alive. These weren't elaborate story arcs, more like quick cameos and nods, but they thrilled a generation glued to both arcades and Saturday mornings. Behind the curtain, the crossover was fueled by licensing chaos. Multiple studios scrambled to secure rights to different arcade characters, and crossovers became a natural byproduct. The animation itself was rushed, often inconsistent, but the magic of seeing familiar video game faces together outweighed any flaws. Though forgotten today, these fleeting crossovers hinted at what was coming: a multimedia age where video games, cartoons, and merchandise would intertwine endlessly. Scooby-Doo meets the Harlem Globetrotters, 1981 reruns. Though the original episodes aired in the 1970s, reruns of Scooby-Doo's crossover with the Harlem Globetrotters dominated Saturday mornings in the early 80s, making it one of the decade's most unforgettable cartoon fusions. The pairing of a mystery-solving dog with a real-world basketball team sounded absurd, yet it became a pop culture hit. Children marveled at the slapstick antics. Scooby and Shaggy fumbling through haunted houses while Meadowlark Lemon spun basketballs to outwit villains. The Globetrotters weren't just cameos, they were animated guest stars who shared the spotlight equally with the Mystery Inc. gang. Behind the scenes, Hanna-Barbera crafted the crossover as a ratings boost. The Globetrotters were household names thanks to their live tours, and combining their brand with Scooby-Doo guaranteed attention. Some writers grumbled about the absurdity of basketball detectives, but the formula worked. Critics dismissed the episodes as gimmicky, yet children adored them, and toy companies cashed in with crossover. Merchandise. For many viewers, these episodes blurred the line between sports celebrity and animated fantasy. Though odd in hindsight, the Globetrotters' Scooby crossover proved that the 1980s thrived on spectacle, and no pairing was too strange if it kept Saturday mornings magical. My Little Pony meets the Princess Promenade characters, 1986. In 1986, My Little Pony and Friends aired a crossover special that expanded the pastel-colored world with a parade of new magical creatures in the Princess Promenade. While not as famous as later My Little Pony reboots, this crossover was a major event for young audiences. The special united the ponies with characters designed solely to test new toy lines, whimsical bush woolies, flutter ponies, and royalty-themed figures. For Hasbro, this was pure marketing strategy. Create a crossover event, air it on television, then release the new toys in stores the same week. Behind the scenes, animators struggled to balance the established personalities of core ponies like Firefly and Twilight with an influx of newcomers. Writers leaned into fairy tale tropes, filling the screen with rainbows, castles, and musical numbers. Children were enchanted, but critics rolled their eyes at the transparent commercial motives. Still, for fans who grew up with it, The Princess Promenade was unforgettable. It showed how crossovers didn't just merge worlds, they also served as a launchpad for bigger toy universes. The Care Bears Meet Strawberry Shortcake, 1983 TV special. Two of the most marketable 80s franchises collided in The Care Bears Meet Strawberry Shortcake, a TV special designed to maximize toy and merchandise sales. On screen, it was candy-colored synergy. Bears who spread caring joined forces with a girl who lived in a world of desserts. Together, they battled villains spreading gloom and greed. For children, it was a pastel dream. The soft-spoken Care Bears balanced Strawberry Shortcake's whimsical leadership, creating a crossover that felt both sweet and empowering. Behind the scenes, however, the special was a careful negotiation between licensing giants Kenner and American Greetings. Both wanted to protect their characters' identities while sharing the screen. The special was a ratings success, with merchandise flying off shelves afterward. Critics weren't kind, calling it a glorified commercial, but for fans, the crossover carried emotional weight. Seeing two beloved childhood worlds intertwine created a lasting memory, even if the artistry was thin. Today, it's remembered less for its story and more for the way it symbolized the 1980s marriage of cartoons and consumerism. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends meets the X-Men, 1981 to 1983. Before the X-Men became a global movie franchise, their first real animated exposure came through Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. In several crossover episodes, Spider-Man, Iceman, and Firestar fought side by side with mutants like Cyclops, Wolverine, and Storm. For kids, these were electric moments, heroes from different comics colliding in full animated glory. One famous episode, A Firestar is Born, even showed Wolverine with an Australian accent years before Hugh Jackman made it iconic. Behind the scenes, Marvel used these crossovers as test runs. They wanted to see if the X-Men could resonate with television audiences. Budgets were low and animation was inconsistent, but the impact was undeniable. For many children, this was their very first introduction to Marvel's mutants. Though the series ended quickly, these crossovers planted seeds for the 1990s X-Men, the animated series which changed superhero cartoons forever. Looking back, they stand as proof that even modest Saturday morning experiments could alter pop culture history. DuckTales meets Mickey's Christmas Carol characters, 1987. When DuckTales exploded in 1987, Disney saw an opportunity to connect it with earlier animated classics. In holiday reruns, Scrooge McDuck, already the star of Mickey's Christmas Carol, was woven into crossover promotionals that linked his DuckTales persona to Mickey's festive world. Children barely noticed the brand strategy. To them, it simply made sense. The same miserly Scrooge who had learned lessons from the ghosts of Christmas was now adventuring with Huey, Dewey, and Louie. For Disney, it was a seamless way to tie its newest hit back to its legacy properties. Behind the curtain, executives knew Scrooge's double identity had to be carefully balanced. Was he the bitter Christmas miser or the treasure-hunting adventurer? Animators threaded the needle, crafting promos that suggested both worlds coexisted. Though subtle, these crossovers gave DuckTales an aura of Disney lineage, anchoring it in the company's rich animation history. For many, it was the final crossover of the 80s that truly mattered, an elegant merging of past and future Disney icons. The 1980s taught us that crossovers were more than gimmicks. They were dreams stitched together, moments where worlds collided to spark wonder. Some were brilliant, others bizarre, but all captured a generation's imagination. Which forgotten crossover do you remember most? Like, subscribe, and share your favorite Saturday morning mashup below.